We are ready to jump into the most critical line of the Caro-Kann defense, and that is the advanced variation, which is e4, c6, d4, d5 and e5. White already is trying to gain some space in the center and keeping everything under control. Now there are two main directions here with black, c5 being one of them, and that might be a worthy alternative. But the thing which I don't like about it is that after d takes c5, probably the best bet here for black is to play the move e6. Now it leads to a playable position, but the drawback of this line is that we are closing in our bishop without trying to give a chance to it to get out. Hence, I'm gonna stick to the very main line here. Instead of the move c5, we're gonna play the move bishop f5, and our plan gonna be to play e6 and c5 if white does not do anything. Now this is a very complex position, strategically speaking. There are many ways to play it with white and black, but the good news is that besides the main line, which is knight f3 and bishop e2, and the setups with h4, the other lines with white are not that dangerous. Also, we're gonna have many choices, so white is not going to be very comfortable, or it's not gonna be something very easy to play with white either, because white has to be booked up quite well. Let's start to tackle the lesser moves in this position for white. First of all, what would happen if white plays the timid bishop d3? Actually, this move was played in many games, and also it can be considered as a logical move trying to remove black's most active piece, the f5 bishop. On the other hand, after taking this guy and playing e6, we are going to get into a territory which resembles to a French, but with a very promising difference from black's perspective, and that is we don't have the closed-in bishop on c8. Next up is c5, breaking up the center, and knight c6, knight e7, knight f5 gonna land us in a great position. Now let's just check out a few directions how the game might evolve from here on. White pretty much has two possibilities, and that is to develop the g1 knight either to e2 or f3. So on knight e2, no surprise there, we're gonna break up the center with c5, and on c3 I like the move knight e7. We could have started with knight c6 as well, though the knight really has to go to e7 if we want to finish up the development, and after that the knight is ready to jump to f5 or g6, or even in some cases we're gonna go to c6 and put the other knight to d7 to solidify our center. And the reason why knight e7 right away is the good choice is that after d takes c5, which could be a testing move here, we just play the move knight d7, and turns out that there is no good way for white to keep his position together, and we're gonna get back our pawn right away. White might defend one of those pawns, but after that even knight c6 will be a good choice for us, because that's gonna attack not only the e5 pawn but also the c5 pawn, so black solved all of his problems. On knight e7 actually white probably gonna castle rather than breaking up his own center, but here we are ready to play knight f5, equalizing on the spot. Knight c6, bishop e7, castle should be our plan. And one more detail, that we don't have to be afraid of the move g4, because we can always answer it by knight h4, and that's gonna be a recurring theme. Our plan is to play the move h5, for example on f4, we can play that move, and with that we are going to remove white's g4 pawn, and once that happens our knight gonna find a beautiful outpost on f5, and actually black is already much better. As mentioned before, in this position white could develop with knight f3, but we are still in a good shape after the move c5, and on c3 we're just gonna go ahead and play knight e7 once again. The only critical try for white would be to take on c5. On castle, once again we just play knight f5, knight c6, and we have a very nice position. Actually, on top of d takes c5, white might consider the check on b5, but there we do have a trap. Now obviously we don't want to give up the b7 pawn, so we have to defend it with queen d7, but at first glance it might seem like we are just losing a pawn on c5, but that is not the case. Knight f5 is coming, and suddenly the queen on c5 is trapped, and actually black is winning. So the critical move is what happens if white takes on c5, but as usual there are not gonna be any ways for white to keep the c5 and e5 pawns alive, and we're gonna get back at least one of them. So we're gonna continue with knight g6. Now c5 pawn is hanging, so white should defend it, and here we're gonna follow up with queen c7. Now c5 pawn is under attack, so b4 seems to be logical, and we just play the move knight c6, and turns out that there is no way for white to protect the e5 pawn. Now white might have one more try, and that is to play the move knight a3, and if we don't pay attention, knight b5 might be annoying. But we just play the calm a6, and on the very next move we're gonna collect or pawn back on e5, and I would argue black is already more comfortable due to the fact that we have a better pawn structure and there is nothing to be afraid of. We can even jump back to the very beginning after bishop f5, the starting position of our advanced variation, and we already crossed off bishop d3 from the list. It's not a dangerous move, we're just gonna get an improved version of French after taking it and playing e6, c5. Now there is another bishop move which was played in quite a few games because it might feel very natural, and that is bishop e3, but honestly speaking it does not really achieve anything, and black gets time to get the desired setup very quickly. And on top of that there is this move queen b6, which I think is very promising because we are putting immediate pressure on the b2 pawn, so it's a logical reply on bishop e3, and there is no good way for white to react here. Now let's just check out what he might do. White might consider giving the pawn up with knight d2, that might be a typical reaction, but turns out that we can go ahead and pick up the pawn on b2. White will not have enough compensation. On rook b1, we can pick up the pawn on a2, c2 would be also hanging, but taking on a2 is the most precise way to continue, and on rook b7 we should just quickly develop, so e6, bishop d3, takes, there was one game to that position where in my opinion black should have played the move queen a6, attacking the rook on b7 and also putting some pressure on the d3 pawn, so queen b1 would be one way for white to protect both of those. But here simply knight d7 followed by knight e7, knight f5, keeping in mind the move knight b6, with that putting pressure on rook on b7. Turns out that white does not have enough counterplay. So on queen b6 white could consider the move b3. Now this is a move which white is never happy to make due to the fact that he weakens up his queen side, and simply strategically speaking in the long run it's just gonna be a move which he would have been happier not to make. And actually there is a concrete idea here for black which I really like, and that is to make the move e6, which we would done anyways, and on knight f3 we could go and play the logical c5, which is good enough, but also we can go ahead and play the move bishop b4 check. And actually there is a nasty trap here, because on the natural knight bd2, surprisingly white is already losing a pawn and he's in a big trouble. We go bishop c3, attacking the rook, and not only attacking the rook, but on rook b1 we go bishop g4, and turns out that the d4 pawn cannot be defended. It might seem like it's well defended right now, but just imagine bishop f3 and bishop d4 on the next two moves and try to find a way for white to protect that guy on d4, and turns out there is no way. We are winning a pawn, and with that we're gonna have a superior position. So on bishop b4 check, if white does not want to blunder a pawn, he has to go c3, and here we once again have a concrete solution, as that is to take on b1. Obviously taking back on b1 is not an option for white because c3 would be hanging. Hence white really is supposed to take on b4, and here we just retreat with the bishop to e4, b4 pawn is hanging, knight e7 castle is coming, and we have a very healthy position. I believe the most interesting move on queen b6 is to follow up with queen c1, and on e6 if white wants to make some sense out of his play, he can play the move c4. I do feel that there are multiple ways to continue with black. Knight d7 is the move which I really like, though I would like to mention that bishop b1, rook b1, bishop b4 check could be a smart idea, because on bishop d2 we would just start to exchange pieces and actually black would have a very nice position without any problems. But turns out that there's a very smart move available for white, and that is to keep the pair of bishop alive with king d1, and on top of that threatening us with c5, a3, trapping the bishop on b4, and we're gonna have some problems. We cannot really develop as we would like to. For example, we cannot take on c4 and play knight e7 because a3 followed by b4 would trap our bishop on b4. Hence there are gonna be some practical problems. The move which I really like is just to play the move knight d7. Here white's idea is probably to play c5. Now if white plays knight f3, we're gonna do the same thing as we would on c5. We're gonna break up white's pawn chain, and that is with the move f6, and that's something that we have to remember, and we're gonna see that pawn break quite a few times in different lines as well, and that's a very healthy way to continue. We don't have to be afraid of the move c5, we can just retreat with the queen to d8, and on e takes f6, knight g takes f6, gonna land us in a very nice position. Bishop e2, bishop e7, castle could be one way to go, and the e6 pawn might seem like a weakness, and it is a backward pawn, that's true. Though looking at white's piece arrangement, it's kind of clear that white doesn't have any good ways to put pressure on it, and also white has to be very careful, because once we can play e5 or b6 and we start to break up white's center, white's position can scramble quite easily. So once again, that's just a healthy position without anything to be afraid of. Now on knight d7, white can try to move c5 right away, and here we can go back to d8 with the queen, or we can even include queen a5 check with the idea of meeting bishop d2 with queen d8. With that, actually the bishop on d2 would be even worse than it is on e3. Or on knight c3, we can start to break up white's center. That's very important. Actually, in these type of positions, if we play very slowly and we are not trying to break up white's center, then white will have a huge space advantage, and that would be very uncomfortable, and sooner or later we're gonna face some problems. So timing is important, and we should start act accordingly. Hence, now we're gonna play the move b6, which is always a good idea to think about whenever our opponents play c5. And turns out that once again, white has no good way to keep his center intact, and if he takes on b6, we take back with the a pawn and follow it up with bishop b4, and actually we are ready to play knight e7, castle, and break up the center once again with c5, and as mentioned before, f6 gonna be another break at our disposal, and with that we have a very nice position. Now jumping back to the very beginning, the move bishop e3 here is not dangerous. We can go queen b6, and white already have to make a concession and make a move which he is not that happy about. Now let's move on, let's check out another move which is played quite frequently, though it's not such a great move, and that is the move g4. Now this move was played by some very strong grandmasters, but I do believe that it rather just have a surprise value, and that's why it's tried out quite many times. Here white's idea is either to gain lots of space if we just go back with the bishop with f4 for example, and push up all the pawns and put some pressure on us, and if the bishop goes away on h7 b1 diagonal, white will have this typical pawn sacrifice idea with e6. That e6 move could be annoying if we don't know what we are doing, but actually it's quite easy to deal with that. So in this position, there is an important move to remember, and that is we're gonna go bishop e4. Actually, once we see this move, it's very logical, because here white has to play f3. By the way, knight f3 is obviously a legal move, which saves the rook on h1 as well, but here white's setup does not make any sense with h2, g4, f2, and pinning his own knight on f3. Here we can just continue with our general plan, and that is to play the move e6, and on knight d2, retreat with the bishop to g6, and on h4, almost always we're just gonna play the move h5. Now this position could be interesting for white if white could play the move knight f4, putting some pressure on the g6 bishop and the h5 pawn, but since the knight was already lured to f3 with the move bishop e4, here white is in trouble. His g4 pawn gonna be cann in the next move, and that means they're gonna be once again an outpost for our knight on f5, and after that we're just gonna do our usual thing, break up the center with c5, place the knight on c6, put pressure on the d4 pawn, and black is already better. So on bishop e4, white has to play the move f3, and actually this is advantageous for us to include that move and only retreat to g6 right now, because white weakened up his king side quite a bit, and also potentially speaking he might need the f3 square for either the queen or the knight. As mentioned beforehand, here e6 gonna be white's idea, and we're gonna take a look at it in one moment. Though white could start with the move knight e2, trying to place the knight on f4, and on e6, now queen h4 would be a threat, and play the move h4. Now we're gonna take a look at the exact same position but from a different move order, and that is after bishop g6, white could start with h4 right away. As mentioned before, here without thinking, almost always we should just play the move h5. Now just a side note, most of the times h6 gonna be another possibility, but the reason why I prefer h5 is that we are putting some pressure on white's king side right away, and also we are not letting white to gain too much space with the move h5 for example. So the reply h5 on h4 seems more healthy to me than h6, and I would stick to that move almost exclusively. And here white can try the move e6, that's gonna be the main try. On top of that, we do have the idea of knight e2. Now here we're just gonna go e6, and on knight f4 we are ready to protect everything on the king side with knight e7. That's a nice setup for us. Now the g6 bishop is covered by this guy, the h5 pawn is still protected, and given a bit more time we could solve the tension on the king side by taking on g4 and after that removing the bishop on h7. So for example, after knight c3 we would take on g4 as mentioned before and move back the bishop on h7. And here we are once again ready to try to put pressure on white's center with the move c5, and we are having a good position. For example, bishop e3 can still be followed up by c5, and we are not afraid of d takes c5. Here one important moment comes, one thing which was already mentioned briefly beforehand. This knight does not have any good squares left, but knight c6 seems to be the perfect move, especially when the c5 and e5 pawns are weak. Placing the e knight to c6 gonna allow us to play knight d7 on the very next move, and with that put even more pressure on the weakened up pawns on e5, c5 and getting back our material. So for example on bishop b5, the smart way to play would be to play a6 first. Now on bishop c6 we would play knight c6, so white probably wants to avoid that with bishop a4 and play the move knight d7. Obviously we could have done that one move earlier, but playing a6, bishop a4 is gonna be something which favors black at least a bit, so why not include that pair of moves. Jumping back to the critical position, after the move h5, if white plays bishop d3, here actually after take and playing e6, white gonna be in trouble. Now we are threatening to take on g4, and after that h4 would be hanging, and if white plays the move g5, which is already a necessity for him, actually we have a simple idea of planting our knight on f5, and black is doing very well. We just have to keep in mind that we're gonna follow up sooner or later with c5, knight c6. So jumping back to the critical position here, white really should play the move e6. And white's idea with this pawn sacrifice is that once we take it, what we should do, the bishop on f8 gonna be quite bad, and also our pawn structure weakened up quite a bit. The e6 pawn is backward and weak and also doubled, so white might claim some counterplay for the sacrificed pawn. On the other hand, not only he gave up a pawn, but he also weakened up his king side with this expansion there, and with that black should be all fine. Now this position is exactly the same as it would be if white played the move e6 after bishop g6 right away, and that's the main direction actually, or that's the most frequent way how white plays. And once we take, white could play h4, and that's where we gonna transpose from the previous line. By the way, bishop d3 here would be a mistake as well, even without h4, h5 included. Besides other things, the move which I really like is to go e5, and on bishop g6 just take it back, and once white takes on e5 we play e6. Turns out that in this position white is much worse. Queen h4 is a threat, so bishop e3 trying to cover queen h4 with bishop f2 is logical. Knight d7, and now e5 is attacked, so f4. Now we continue with knight h6, threatening to play queen h4 check, picking up the pawn on g4, so h4, defending against that. Bishop e7, once again, coming with a tempi, attacking the pawn on h4, and on g5 we just jump into f5 with the knight, and black is winning according to the computer. It might be a little bit surprising because material is still equal, we do have a worse pawn structure if we are strictly looking at it. On the other hand, white has weakened up his king side. We have beautiful knight on f5, pressure against the h4 pawn, and the f4 pawn is also a backward pawn which gonna be weak. Also black is the one who has the bigger center, which gonna be able to roll sooner or later, and white is also underdeveloped. Adding all those things up, it should not be such a big surprise after all that black is already winning. So after we take back on e6, white really should go and play h4, and as mentioned before, I would just play the move h5. There were some other games with other continuations as well, but h5 is the most logical move. We don't want to give too much space for the opponent. Now, just one example once again how we could solve the problem if white does not put too much pressure on us, and that is on g5. We can go ahead and play the move e5, and if white takes, what else? We just go ahead and play e6. Material is still equal, but once again we're gonna have amazing grip over the light squares. The knight will be able to jump to f5, the bishop is ready to go to c5, the white pawn on e5 is slightly weak, the f3 pawn is backward, and white weakened up his king side quite a bit without achieving